Let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. We are hearing good things from both sides. Russia has said it is willing to speak to Ukraine without any preconditions, and Ukraine has agreed to embark on the quote-unquote difficult path to peace. But there is one statement by Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov that we want to talk about. He has said, and I'm quoting, "Russia needs to reach a peace agreement with Ukraine rather than the United States." This seems like a simple statement, but one that carries lessons from the past and a key to the future. So here are some of the questions we are tackling today. Why does Russia want to talk to Ukraine directly now? Is Ukraine being naive to trust the West again? And what does history teach us about the West? I'm Ananya Dutta, and you're watching Grey Zone. Let's go back to 2015 Minsk. Four leaders met after the 2015 Eastern Ukraine conflict. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin, then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton. But this photo op was as deceiving as what will be later called the Minsk Agreement. The agreement was between the Ukrainian government and self-proclaimed independence from the Donbas region. France, Germany, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe had mediated this deal. Where was Russia in it? It was a mere signatory to the agreement, even though it was the instigator of this very conflict. Experts have argued Ukraine was put under pressure to sign a deal that was not in its favor. 7 years later, Russia used this very statement to justify the 2022 war. We're often told the story of the Ukraine-Russia war from February 24, 2022. At 5:30 in the morning, President Vladimir Putin gave a national address that shocked the world. The speech had prompted a full-scale war against Ukraine, or as Putin called it, a special military operation. This is Putin's war, but the West isn't an innocent bystander. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US decided to expand NATO, even after giving its word that it will not. The expansion started in 1990s and continued till early 2000s, when Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all of which that had been part of the former Soviet Union, were part of NATO now. Joe Biden's CIA director, William J. Burns, was a political officer in the US Embassy in Moscow at the time. He reported to Washington, and I'm quoting from it, "Hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here." When the Ukraine war started, Russia's attack, wrong, but was seen in isolation.
The big mistake that Ukraine made was abandoning neutrality and aiming to become part of NATO. And to do that on Russia's border was reckless behavior, absolutely dangerous and provocative. And I told the Ukrainians that don't go that route. You will create grave risks for yourself.
Within 2 months of the war, Russia and Ukraine met in Istanbul for peace talks. They even appeared to agree on a tentative deal. But multiple reports and leaders privy to the conversation said that the West forced Ukraine to abandon all talks with Russia. The decision to scuttle the deal coincided with then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit to Kyiv, during which he urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to break off talks with Russia.
The terms that Ukraine could have gotten 3 years ago, on April 15th, 2022, in the Istanbul Process, were better terms than they can get now. And the United States talked them out of it, and Zelensky abandoned the negotiations 3 years ago.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett also revealed that he tried to broker an early ceasefire, where Kyiv was willing to give up its NATO membership bid, and Moscow agreed to drop the main aspect of its invasion. But even then, Ukraine was stopped by the US, Germany, and France. In 1975, the world watched as helicopters evacuated Americans from the rooftop of the US Embassy in Saigon. In 2021, it was Kabul, where NATO fought the Taliban for 2 long decades before fleeing the country, handing the power back to the Taliban. So from Saigon to Kabul to Kyiv, history has taught us better about the West. It makes promises and gives hope. Then when the cost becomes too high or the tension wanes, the West pulls back. And now in 2025, all eyes are on Ukraine. Boris Johnson has resigned, Joe Biden has been branded non-existent in US politics, and Olaf Scholz is on his way out in Germany. Everyone's gone, and so have their promises. Today we have Donald Trump in the White House, who won his election on the promise that he can end this very war in one day. 100 days later, he has signed a minerals deal with Zelensky and is expected to meet Putin in person. It's again the West's way or the highway. Can Ukraine end this cycle?
Henry Kissinger said to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, to be a friend is fatal. And what he meant by that is when the U.S. tells you something like, oh, why don't you join NATO? This can be fatal to you. The Ukrainians were very naive. Mr. Kuleba is very naive. Mr. Zelensky is very naive. They thought, oh, the U.S. has our back. I tried to tell them for years, if you go down that road, Ukraine will be destroyed. If you stay with neutrality, Ukraine will be safe.
Ukraine needs the West. It needs the West money, support, and security. Ukraine feels it has no choice but to agree. It was the same thinking during the Minsk Agreement. Then Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin had said, and I'm quoting again, if we don't sign this agreement, then what are we going to do? It's this very helplessness that the West is banking on. The US is out, but when has the UK, France, and Germany acted not out of selfish interests? When Russia is asking for a peace deal with Ukraine and not the US, maybe President Volodymyr Zelensky should listen, unlike his predecessors. Western support often comes with fine print, conditions, political timelines, and shifting priorities. Maybe it's time Kyiv looks at the West with the same suspicion it looks at Moscow with. I'm Ananya Dutta for Grey Zone. Thanks for watching.